Hi guys! Welcome to tonight's long-form story, where we're going to take you deep inside the world of medieval craftsmanship, specifically into the heart of a blacksmith's workshop during the height of the Middle Ages. Tonight, we'll explore every corner of Master Edmund's forge in the village of Millbrook, circa 1347, where the rhythm of hammer on anvil created the very tools that built medieval society. We'll witness the daily routines, the intricate processes, the community connections, and the profound dedication required to shape raw iron into the implements of daily life. From the moment the bellows first breathe life into the morning coals to the final quenching of the day's last piece, we'll experience the methodical, meditative world of medieval metalworking. You'll hear about the apprentices learning their craft, the customers who depend on the smith's expertise, and the countless small moments that made up this essential trade. This isn't just about making horseshoes and nails. It's about understanding a way of life that sustained entire communities for centuries, where every strike of the hammer carried generations of knowledge, and every piece created served a vital purpose in medieval society. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I really enjoy seeing where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. The morning mist still clung to the cobblestones of Millbrook when Master Edmund Hartwell pushed open the heavy oak door of his smithy. The familiar creak of the iron hinges announced the beginning of another day in his world of fire and metal. At 42 years of age, Edmund had spent nearly 3 decades perfecting his craft, having begun as a wide-eyed apprentice at the age of 14. His hands, now permanently stained with soot and calloused from countless hours at the anvil, moved with the practiced certainty of someone who had repeated these same morning rituals thousands of times before. The smithy itself was a substantial stone building, built to withstand the intense heat and occasional sparks that were inevitable in the blacksmith's trade. Its walls, constructed of local limestone, were nearly 3 feet thick at the base, tapering slightly as they rose to support the steep slate roof. Small windows, fitted with oiled parchment rather than expensive glass, allowed just enough natural light to supplement the glow of the forge fire. The floor was packed earth mixed with charcoal dust and iron filings, creating a surface that could absorb the occasional drop of molten metal without catching fire. Edmund's first task each morning was to examine the forge fire from the previous evening. Like many smiths, he maintained a low fire throughout the night, banking the coals carefully to preserve the heat while preventing the waste of fuel. Coal was expensive in Millbrook, transported by cart from mines nearly 50 miles away, so every piece had to be used efficiently. He poked at the glowing embers with a long iron rod, assessing their condition. The coals glowed a deep orange red, indicating they had retained enough heat to be quickly brought back to working temperature. The coal merchant, Master Robert Ashford, visited Millbrook once every fortnight with his heavily laden wagons. His coal came from deep mines in the northern counties, where skilled miners descended into narrow shafts to extract the precious fuel. The quality varied considerably depending on the seam from which it was taken. Some coal burned hot and clean with minimal smoke, while inferior grades produced excessive ash and noxious fumes that could make working conditions unbearable. Edmund had learned through experience to evaluate each delivery carefully, paying premium prices only for the finest grades that would serve his forge most efficiently. The relationship between blacksmith and coal merchant was built on mutual trust and understanding. Robert knew that Edmund's reputation depended on consistent quality work, which required reliable fuel. In return, Edmund paid promptly and never quibbled over prices for superior coal. This partnership had developed over many years and represented the type of business relationship that formed the backbone of medieval commerce. The cost of coal represented a significant portion of Edmund's operating expenses. During busy periods, the forge might consume several hundredweight of coal in a single day, each pound carefully rationed to maximize its heating value. Edmund had developed techniques for extending coal's effectiveness by mixing it with charcoal and controlling airflow to achieve complete combustion. These efficiency measures were essential to maintaining profitability while providing the intense heat required for quality metalwork. The storage and handling of coal required careful attention to prevent waste and deterioration. Edmund's coal shed was built with a slate roof and stone walls to protect the fuel from moisture, which could reduce its heating value and create excessive smoke when burned. The coal was stored in wooden bins that allowed air circulation while preventing the fine dust from being scattered by wind. Regular turning of the stored coal prevented the formation of damp spots that could cause spontaneous combustion or fuel degradation. Working the leather bellows was always the first real effort of the day. These bellows, crafted by the village's leatherworker using oxhide and fitted with Edmund's own iron hinges and valves, were essential to his trade. The bellows consisted of two chambers that alternately filled with air and expelled it into the forge through a copper tube, creating a steady stream of oxygen that would transform the banked coals into a roaring fire hot enough to soften iron. Edmund grasped the wooden handle and began the rhythmic pumping motion that every blacksmith knew by heart. Push down, pull up. Push down, pull up. The leather wheezed and sighed with each stroke, and gradually the coals began to brighten from orange to yellow to the brilliant white-hot temperature needed for serious metalwork. The construction of the bellows had been a significant investment when Edmund first established his smithy. Master Geoffrey the leatherworker had required nearly 2 months to complete the project, using only the finest ox hides that had been specially treated to resist the heat and moisture of forge work. The leather had been soaked in oak bark solutions that tanned it to the proper consistency, then treated with neatsfoot oil to maintain flexibility despite exposure to temperature extremes. The iron fittings that Edmund had forged for the bellows were equally critical to their operation. The hinges had to operate smoothly despite constant use, while the valves that controlled airflow needed precise adjustment to maximize efficiency. Edmund had crafted these components with the same attention to detail that he applied to customer work, knowing that any failure in the bellows system would shut down his entire operation until repairs could be completed. Regular maintenance of the bellows was an ongoing responsibility that Edmund took seriously. The leather required periodic treatment with oils and waxes to prevent cracking and maintain suppleness. The iron fittings needed lubrication and adjustment to compensate for wear. Small leaks in the leather could reduce efficiency significantly, requiring careful patching with matching materials and specialized adhesives. The rhythm of bellows operation was so fundamental to blacksmith work that Edmund could maintain it unconsciously while focusing on other tasks. His arms and shoulders had developed the specific strength and endurance needed for hours of continuous pumping. The motion had become as natural as breathing, integrated into the very fabric of his working life. Young apprentices often struggled initially with the coordination required to maintain steady airflow while simultaneously managing hot iron and hammer work. The copper tube that delivered air from the bellows to the forge was another critical component that required regular attention. The intense heat of the forge gradually oxidized the copper, creating scale that could restrict airflow if not removed regularly. Edmund used wire brushes and abrasive compounds to keep the interior surfaces clean and smooth. The tube's position relative to the fire could be adjusted to direct air precisely where it was needed most, a technique that allowed him to create specific temperature zones within the forge for different types of work. As the fire came to life, Edmund surveyed his workspace. The anvil, his most prized possession, sat on a massive oak stump that he had selected and prepared himself 15 years earlier. The anvil weighed nearly 200 pounds and had been forged by a master smith in the county seat, purchased with 3 months' earnings when Edmund had finally established his own shop. Its face was smooth and perfectly flat, maintained through daily use and careful attention. Around the anvil, within easy reach, stood his collection of hammers. There were heavy sledgehammers for rough shaping, medium cross-peen hammers for general work, and delicate ball-peen hammers for detail work. Each hammer had been balanced specifically for his hands and style of work. The morning light gradually strengthened as Edmund organized his materials for the day ahead. Against one wall stood his stock of iron, carefully sorted by size and quality. Most of it was wrought iron, which had been refined from raw pig iron to remove most of the carbon that made it brittle. This wrought iron was ideal for most of his work because it was malleable when heated and could be shaped with relative ease. Some pieces were salvaged iron, carefully cleaned and prepared for reuse. In medieval times, iron was far too valuable to waste, and a skilled smith could often remake old tools into new ones with minimal loss of material. His first customer of the day arrived just as the morning church bells finished chiming the hour of prime. Thomas, the miller, needed repairs to the iron bands that held his millstones in proper alignment. These bands were crucial to the miller's work as they prevented the heavy stones from shifting during the grinding process. Any misalignment could ruin grain or even damage the stones themselves, representing a significant financial loss for Thomas and potentially affecting the village's bread supply. The millstones that Thomas operated were massive circular stones, each weighing several tons and precisely shaped to grind grain efficiently. The upper stone, called the runner, rotated against the lower bedstone, crushing grain between their carefully textured surfaces. The iron bands that held these stones were not merely functional hardware, but precision-engineered components that had to maintain exact tolerances despite tremendous rotational forces and constant vibration. The miller's trade was one of the most technically demanding in the medieval village. Thomas had inherited both his mill and his knowledge from his father, who had learned the subtle arts of stone dressing, gear maintenance, and grain handling through decades of experience. The relationship between miller and blacksmith was particularly close, because the mill's operation depended entirely on properly functioning iron components that only a skilled smith could maintain and repair. The water wheel that powered Thomas's mill was itself a marvel of medieval engineering. Constructed primarily of oak timbers, joined with iron hardware, it captured the energy of the village stream and transmitted it through a series of wooden gears to the grinding stones above. Every component of this power transmission system required regular maintenance, much of which fell to Edmund's expertise with iron repair and fabrication. The grinding process itself was controlled by adjusting the gap between the stones using iron screw mechanisms that Edmund had fabricated years earlier. These screws allowed Thomas to accommodate different types of grain and achieve various degrees of fineness in the finished flour. The precision required for this adjustment was remarkable. Differences of mere fractions of an inch could mean the difference between perfectly ground flour and ruined grain. Thomas explained to Edmund how the current problem had developed gradually over several weeks of operation. The iron band had begun showing small cracks near one of its mounting points, cracks that had slowly propagated until they threatened the band's structural integrity. The constant stress cycles from the mill's operation had caused what modern engineers would recognize as fatigue failure, a phenomenon that medieval craftsmen understood empirically even without the scientific theory to explain it. The economic implications of mill equipment failure extended far beyond Thomas's immediate business concerns. The mill served not only Millbrook but several surrounding hamlets, processing grain for hundreds of families. Any significant delay in mill operation could affect bread production throughout the region, potentially creating food shortages during critical periods like harvest season or winter storage. Edmund's examination of the damaged band revealed the complex stresses that mill equipment endured during normal operation. The iron had to resist not only the static weight of the massive stones, but also the dynamic forces created by their rotation, the vibrations transmitted from the water wheel, and the thermal expansion and contraction caused by temperature variations throughout the day and seasons. Edmund examined the damaged band carefully, running his fingers along the crack that had developed where the metal curved around the stone. The iron had fatigued from the constant vibration and stress of the mill's operation. This type of repair required careful heating and forge welding, a process that would join the cracked metal back into a single, strong piece. He explained to Thomas that the repair would take most of the morning, as the metal would need to be heated multiple times and worked gradually to avoid weakening it further. With Thomas gone to attend to other business, Edmund began the careful process of heating the iron band. He placed one section into the forge fire, using long-handled tongs to position it precisely where the heat was most intense. The iron began to change color as it absorbed heat, progressing from its natural dark gray to a dull red, then to cherry red, and finally to the bright orange that indicated it was ready to work. This color change was one of the most important skills a blacksmith had to master, as working iron at the wrong temperature could ruin a piece or make it impossible to shape properly. The rhythm of the work was almost meditative. Edmund would heat a section of the band, remove it from the fire, place it on the anvil, and strike it with measured blows of his hammer. Each strike had to be precise, not just in terms of where it landed, but in terms of how hard it was delivered. Too light, and the metal wouldn't move enough to be useful. Too heavy, and the iron might crack or develop weak spots. The sound of hammer on anvil rang through the smithy, a steady metallic music that announced to the entire village that Edmund was at work. Between heating cycles, Edmund took time to prepare for his next tasks. His apprentice, young William, arrived just as the sun cleared the rooftops of the surrounding buildings. William was 16 years old and had been working with Edmund for 2 years, learning the countless small skills that made up the blacksmith's trade. His first responsibility each morning was to organize the tools and materials that Edmund would need throughout the day, a task that required him to understand not just what each tool was for, but how Edmund's work habits and preferences influenced which tools he would reach for in any given situation. William's training had begun with the most basic tasks: maintaining the fire, organizing materials, and cleaning tools. Gradually, he had been allowed to handle some of the simpler metalwork, always under Edmund's watchful supervision. Today, Edmund planned to let William practice making square nails, a fundamental skill that every blacksmith's apprentice had to master before moving on to more complex work. Nails were in constant demand throughout the village, used in construction, repairs, and countless other applications where pieces of wood needed to be joined together. The process of making a nail began with preparing the iron rod. Edmund showed William how to select a piece of iron rod about 1/4 inch thick and cut it into pieces roughly 3 inches long. Each piece would become a single nail, with the excess length providing material for the head. The first step was to heat one end of the rod until it glowed bright orange. Then place it through a hole in a special tool called a nail header. This tool held the rod steady while the smith hammered the protruding end to form the nail's head. William's first attempts were clumsy, as expected. He held the hammer too tightly, making his strikes stiff and inaccurate. The nail heads were uneven and off-center, creating nails that would be difficult to drive straight. Edmund patiently corrected his technique, showing him how to let the hammer bounce naturally off the anvil and use the tool's weight rather than muscle force to shape the metal. "Feel the iron," Edmund instructed. "Let it tell you when it's ready to move and where it wants to go." While William practiced his nail-making, Edmund returned to the miller's iron band. The crack had been cleaned and prepared for welding, which would involve heating both sides of the break until they were nearly molten, then hammering them together to create a seamless joint. This process, called forge welding, was one of the most demanding skills in blacksmithing, requiring perfect timing and temperature control. If the iron was too cool, the pieces wouldn't join properly. If it was too hot, the metal might burn or become weakened by excessive oxidation. The art of forge welding had been passed down through generations of blacksmiths, each master adding refinements to techniques that dated back to the earliest days of ironworking. Edmund had learned the fundamentals from his own master, but had spent years perfecting the subtle details that separated competent work from true craftsmanship. The ability to consistently produce high-quality forge welds was one of the hallmarks that distinguished mastersmiths from ordinary metalworkers. The preparation for forge welding began long before the iron reached welding temperature. The surfaces to be joined had to be perfectly clean, free from scale, dirt, or any contamination that might prevent proper fusion. Edmund used files and abrasive stones to create bright, clean metal surfaces, then protected them from oxidation until the welding operation began. This preparation work was tedious but essential to achieving reliable results. The flux materials that Edmund used to facilitate welding had been carefully prepared from materials he gathered and processed himself. Borax was the primary ingredient, a mineral salt that prevented oxidation at welding temperatures while helping to dissolve any impurities that might interfere with the metal fusion. Edmund mixed his flux with small amounts of iron filings and charcoal dust, creating a compound that was perfectly suited to his specific working conditions and techniques. The temperature control required for successful forge welding was achieved through a combination of fire management, timing, and experience-based judgment that could not be easily taught or learned from books. Edmund had to recognize the subtle visual cues that indicated proper welding heat, a specific color and surface appearance that meant the iron was ready to fuse properly. This skill required years of practice to develop and constant attention to maintain. The welding process itself was a race against time and oxidation. Once the iron reached proper temperature, Edmund had only moments to position the pieces correctly, apply flux, and complete the hammerwork that would create the weld. Any hesitation or error in technique could result in a failed joint that would be weaker than the original material. The pressure to work quickly while maintaining precision was one of the most challenging aspects of the blacksmith's craft. The hammer technique used for forge welding was different from that used for normal shaping operations. The blows had to be firm enough to forge the metals together, but not so heavy as to drive out all the molten material that facilitated the welding process. Edmund used a series of overlapping light blows that gradually worked across the entire joint area, ensuring complete fusion while maintaining the proper metal thickness. The success of a forge weld could not be fully evaluated until after the joint had cooled and been tested under load. A weld that appeared perfect when hot might reveal flaws when subjected to stress, making quality control an ongoing concern throughout the welding process. Edmund's reputation depended on producing welds that would perform reliably throughout the service life of the repaired component. Edmund sprinkled a small amount of borax powder along the edges of the crack. This flux would help prevent oxidation during the heating process and allow the metal surfaces to join more cleanly. He then placed the band back into the fire, adjusting the position carefully to ensure even heating. The bellows wheezed steadily as William pumped them, maintaining the intense heat needed for welding temperature. The iron reached welding heat just as the church bells chimed the mid-morning hour. Edmund quickly removed the piece from the fire and positioned it on the anvil. The metal glowed almost white-hot, with tiny sparks dancing along its surface. Working with swift, sure strokes, he hammered the crack closed, the two sides of the break flowing together like thick honey. The sound was different from normal hammering, softer and more muffled as the nearly molten iron absorbed the impact. Within moments, the weld was complete, the crack now invisible except for a slight line where the flux had been consumed in the process. The repaired band would need to cool slowly to prevent it from becoming brittle. Edmund buried it in a pile of charcoal dust where it would cool gradually over several hours. This controlled cooling, called annealing, was just as important as the welding itself. Metal that cooled too quickly from high temperatures often developed internal stresses that could lead to cracking or failure in service. With the morning's major repair work completed, Edmund turned his attention to the day's production work. His inventory of finished goods was running low, and several regular customers would be expecting their usual orders to be ready. The village carpenter needed a new set of wood chisels to replace ones that had been damaged in a recent project. The local farmers were approaching harvest season and would soon need repairs to their scythes and sickles. The innkeeper had requested several iron pothooks for the kitchen fireplace. Chisel making was work that Edmund particularly enjoyed. Unlike the rough, utilitarian pieces that made up much of his daily production, chisels required precision and attention to detail. A good chisel had to hold a sharp edge while remaining strong enough to withstand heavy use. The balance between hardness and toughness was critical. Too hard, and the chisel would be brittle and prone to chipping. Too soft, and it would dull quickly and require constant sharpening. The design of woodworking chisels had evolved over centuries of use, with each generation of craftsmen contributing refinements that improved performance and durability. The profile of the blade, the angle of the cutting edge, the taper from tang to tip, and the cross-sectional geometry all affected how the chisel would perform in actual use. Edmund understood these relationships intuitively, having made hundreds of chisels over his career and received feedback from the carpenters and woodworkers who used them. The selection of steel for chisel making required careful consideration of the intended use. Chisels for fine finishing work needed very hard steel that could hold an extremely sharp edge, even if this made them somewhat more brittle. Heavy-duty chisels for rough construction work required tougher steel that could absorb shock loads without breaking, even if the edge required more frequent sharpening. Edmund maintained stocks of different steel types to match the requirements of various applications. The forging process for chisels began with heating the steel to a bright orange color that indicated it was ready to deform under hammer blows. The initial shaping involved drawing out the tang that would fit into the wooden handle, a process that required gradual reduction of the steel's cross-section while maintaining straight, parallel sides. This drawing out process had to be done carefully to avoid creating weak spots or irregular grain structure in the finished tool. The blade portion of the chisel required different forging techniques than the tang. The steel had to be spread laterally to create the proper width while maintaining uniform thickness across the entire cutting edge. Edmund used specialized hammers and anvil tools to control the metal flow precisely, ensuring that the finished blade would have optimal geometry for its intended use. The transition from tang to blade was a critical area that required careful attention during forging. This region experienced high stresses during use and had to be shaped with smooth curves that would not create stress concentration points. Sharp corners or abrupt changes in cross-section could initiate cracks that would eventually cause tool failure. The establishment of proper blade geometry required multiple heating and shaping cycles, with careful attention to maintaining straightness and preventing warping. Edmund used various checking methods to ensure that the blade remained flat and straight throughout the forging process. Any deviation from proper geometry would affect the chisel's cutting performance and might require extensive correction work or complete reforging. The final shaping of the cutting edge required the most precise hammer control and temperature management. The edge had to be forged to a consistent angle and thickness that would provide optimal cutting performance while maintaining adequate strength. This work was done at lower temperatures with lighter hammer blows to avoid overworking the steel or creating surface irregularities. Throughout the forging process, Edmund paid careful attention to the steel's grain structure and internal condition. Overheating or excessive working could damage the steel's internal structure, reducing its ability to respond properly to heat treatment. The appearance of the steel's surface and the sound it made under hammer blows provided clues about its internal condition that guided Edmund's decisions about temperature and technique. Edmund selected a piece of high-carbon steel for the chisel blades. This steel, which contained more carbon than the wrought iron he used for most work, was much more expensive but essential for tools that needed to hold a sharp edge. He had purchased it from a traveling merchant who brought steel from the renowned smiths of Sheffield, where the local iron ore and water-powered hammers produced some of the finest steel in England. The process of making a chisel began with heating the steel to a bright orange color and drawing it out to create the long, flat blade. Edmund worked with smooth, overlapping hammer blows, gradually tapering the steel from the thick tang that would fit into the wooden handle to the thin, cutting edge. Each blow had to be perfectly placed to maintain the chisel's straightness and ensure even thickness across the blade width. As he worked, Edmund was aware of the sounds around him. William's hammer rang steadily as he continued practicing nail-making, the rhythm becoming more regular and confident as the morning progressed. Outside, the village was coming to life. Cartwheels rumbled over cobblestones as merchants and farmers began their daily business. Voices called greetings across the street, and somewhere nearby, a rooster crowed its belated announcement of the morning. The steel chisel blade took shape gradually under Edmund's experienced hands. When the rough forging was complete, he began the careful process of refining the shape. Using smaller hammers and working at lower temperatures, he perfected the angles and curves that would make the chisel both functional and comfortable to use. The cutting edge was forged to a precise 30-degree angle that would cut cleanly through wood while remaining strong enough to resist damage. Heat treatment was the next critical step. The blade needed to be hardened to develop the steel's potential for holding a sharp edge, then tempered to reduce brittleness while maintaining adequate hardness. Edmund heated the blade to a bright cherry red, then quickly quenched it in a tub of water. The sudden cooling locked the steel's crystal structure into a very hard but brittle condition. Steam hissed and bubbled violently as the hot metal hit the water, filling the smithy with a cloud of vapor. The hardened blade was now too brittle for use and needed tempering to restore some toughness. Edmund cleaned the surface with sandstone to remove the black oxide scale, revealing the bright steel underneath. He then reheated the blade very carefully, watching as colors began to appear on the cleaned surface. These colors, caused by the formation of thin oxide films, indicated the metal's temperature with remarkable precision. The blade turned first pale yellow, then deeper yellow, then brown, and finally blue as the temperature increased. For a wood chisel, Edmund wanted a straw yellow color, which corresponded to a temperature that would give the optimal balance of hardness and toughness. When the blade reached this color, he quenched it again, this time in oil rather than water. The oil quenching was gentler than water, reducing the risk of cracking while still cooling the blade quickly enough to preserve the desired properties. While the chisel blades cooled, Edmund began work on the handles. These were made from seasoned ash wood, chosen for its strength and shock-absorbing properties. The wood had been air-dried for 2 years to reduce its moisture content and prevent splitting or warping. Edmund shaped each handle on a foot-powered lathe, creating the familiar octagonal cross-section that provided a secure grip while preventing the chisel from rolling when set down on a workbench. The tang of each chisel blade was heated and driven into a hole in the wooden handle, the hot metal burning its way into the wood to create a tight, permanent joint. The smell of burning wood mixed with the metallic odors of hot iron and quenched steel, creating the distinctive atmosphere of the working smithy. By midday, Edmund had completed 3 chisels of different sizes. Each was tested carefully, first by examining the blade for straightness and proper geometry, then by making test cuts in a piece of scrap wood. The cutting action was smooth and clean, with no tendency for the blade to bind or wander off course. Satisfied with their quality, Edmund set them aside to await the carpenter's collection. The afternoon brought a different type of work. Sir Geoffrey, the local manor lord, had sent word that he needed several decorative iron pieces for a new gate he was having constructed. This type of ornamental work was both challenging and rewarding, requiring artistic skill in addition to technical metalworking ability. The pieces would be seen by everyone who visited the manor, making them a showcase for Edmund's craftsmanship. Sir Geoffrey de Montfort had inherited his lands and title from his father, who had fought alongside King Edward in the recent campaigns in France. The manor house that dominated the local landscape was a symbol of Norman authority and wealth, built in the solid stone style that proclaimed both permanence and power. The new gate that Sir Geoffrey was commissioning would serve as the primary entrance to his estate, making a statement about his position in the feudal hierarchy and his appreciation for fine craftsmanship. The commission represented more than just another metalworking project for Edmund. Work for the local nobility carried prestige that elevated a craftsman's reputation throughout the region. Successful completion of manor projects often led to recommendations to other noble families, creating opportunities for additional high-value commissions. The social implications of such work were as important as the technical challenges and financial rewards. The design requirements for noble commissions were typically more complex than those for ordinary village work. Sir Geoffrey wanted ironwork that would complement the stone architecture of his manor, while incorporating heraldic elements that proclaimed his family's lineage and achievements. This required Edmund to understand not only metalworking techniques, but also the symbolic language of medieval heraldry and the aesthetic principles that governed aristocratic taste. The planning phase for ornamental ironwork required careful collaboration between Edmund and Sir Geoffrey's household. The knight had definite ideas about what he wanted the finished pieces to convey, while Edmund had to translate these artistic concepts into practical metalworking projects. Sketches and small-scale models helped bridge the gap between vision and execution, allowing both parties to refine the design before committing to expensive materials and labor. The iron stock required for ornamental work was typically of higher quality than that used for utilitarian pieces. Sir Geoffrey was willing to pay for the finest materials available, including imported iron from renowned sources and specialized alloys that would take decorative finishes more readily. The cost of these premium materials was justified by the permanence and visibility of the finished work. The tools and techniques required for ornamental ironwork differed significantly from those used in everyday blacksmithing. Edmund had invested in specialized hammers, stakes, and forming blocks that allowed him to create the precise curves and detailed textures that distinguished fine decorative work. These tools represented a significant capital investment that was justified only by the premium prices that ornamental work commanded. The time requirements for decorative projects were always longer than clients expected. Each element had to be carefully planned, executed with precision, and finished to exacting standards. Rush jobs in ornamental ironwork invariably resulted in compromised quality that reflected poorly on the craftsman's reputation. Edmund had learned to educate his noble clients about realistic timeframes and to resist pressure for premature completion. The artistic aspects of ornamental ironwork required Edmund to draw upon influences beyond the immediate village environment. He studied examples of fine metalwork in churches and manor houses throughout the region, learning from the techniques and design approaches of master craftsmen from earlier generations. This ongoing education was essential to maintaining competitiveness in the demanding field of decorative metalwork. The design called for a series of scrollwork panels featuring intertwined vines and leaves. Edmund began by sketching the pattern on a piece of parchment, working out the proportions and figuring out how the individual elements would fit together. Unlike utilitarian pieces where function was paramount, decorative work required careful attention to visual balance and artistic flow. The scroll work would be formed from flat iron bars about an inch wide and a quarter-inch thick. Edmund heated the first bar to a bright orange color and began the process of creating the graceful curves that would form the vine pattern. This work required a different set of tools than his usual production pieces. Instead of heavy hammers for rough shaping, he used specialized forming blocks and stakes that allowed him to create smooth, consistent curves. The process was slow and methodical. Each curve had to be formed gradually with multiple heatings and small adjustments. The iron had to be kept at the proper temperature throughout the forming process. Hot enough to bend easily, but not so hot that it became difficult to control. Edmund worked with a light touch, guiding the metal through its path rather than forcing it into position. As the day progressed, the scroll work began to take shape. The main vine curves were completed first, followed by the smaller tendrils and branches that would give the design its organic, flowing appearance. Each element was carefully positioned to maintain the overall balance of the composition while creating interesting visual details that would be apparent from different viewing angles. William had progressed well with his nail-making practice and was now producing consistently acceptable nails. Edmund decided it was time to introduce him to the next level of the craft, making horseshoe nails. These were more challenging than square nails because they required a specific shape and size to work properly with horseshoes. Too large, and they might split the horse's hoof. Too small, and they wouldn't hold the shoe securely. The process began with selecting iron rod of the proper diameter. Horseshoe nails were made from very pure wrought iron that had been drawn through progressively smaller holes to create wire of uniform thickness. This wire was much more expensive than the rough iron used for construction nails, reflecting both the quality of the material and the additional processing required to produce it. Edmund demonstrated the proper technique for forming the nail head. Unlike square nails, which had simple flat heads, horseshoe nails required heads with a specific rectangular shape that would fit properly into the horseshoe's nail holes. The head also had to be oriented correctly relative to the nail shank to ensure that it would drive straight and seat properly when the farrier attached the shoe. William's first attempts at horseshoe nails were less successful than his square nails had been. The different proportions and the more critical tolerances required adjustments to his technique. Edmund was patient but insistent that William understand not just how to make the nails, but why each step was important. A poorly made horseshoe nail could cause a horse to go lame, which might disable a knight's war horse or a farmer's plow animal. While William practiced, Edmund continued with the scrollwork panels. The afternoon light streaming through the smithy's windows provided excellent illumination for the detailed work. As each curve was completed, he checked it against his drawing and made any necessary adjustments. The iron was forgiving of small mistakes when heated, but major errors might require starting over with a new piece of material. The leaf elements of the design were particularly challenging. Each leaf had to be shaped from a small piece of flat iron with veins and texture created through careful hammer work. Edmund used a technique called repose, where the design was hammered from the backside to create raised details on the front surface. This required perfect coordination between his hammer hand and his supporting hand, which held the workpiece against a soft backing material. Late in the afternoon, Father Benedict arrived at the smithy with a request that was both urgent and delicate. The church's bell had developed a crack in its mounting bracket, and Sunday services were only 2 days away. The bell was the pride of the parish, a bronze masterpiece that had been cast in London and transported to Millbrook at considerable expense. The mounting bracket was a complex iron assembly that held the bell in its wooden frame and allowed it to swing freely when rung. The church bell of St. Mary's had been installed during Father Benedict's predecessor's tenure, representing one of the most significant investments the parish had ever made. The bronze casting had been commissioned from Master William de Ashby, one of London's most renowned bell founders, whose work could be found in cathedrals and major churches throughout England. The cost had required contributions from every family in the parish, along with substantial support from Sir Geoffrey and other local landowners. The bell's voice had become an integral part of village life, marking the hours of prayer, announcing births and deaths, warning of dangers, and calling the faithful to worship. Its loss, even temporarily, would disrupt the spiritual and social rhythms that governed medieval community life. The urgency of the repair reflected not just Father Benedict's concern for Sunday services, but the broader community's dependence on the bell's regular voice. The mounting system that supported the bell had been designed by Edmund's predecessor, Master John Ironwright, who had died several years earlier from a fever. The design was ingenious but complex, distributing the bell's considerable weight across multiple support points, while allowing the controlled movement necessary for proper ringing. Understanding and repairing this system would require Edmund to decipher another craftsman's thinking and techniques. The crack in the mounting bracket appeared to have developed gradually over months or years of use. The repetitive stresses of ringing, combined with thermal expansion and contraction from seasonal temperature changes, had created fatigue conditions that eventually overcame the iron's strength. This type of failure was not uncommon in church bell installations, but it always created urgent repair situations because of the bell's central importance to religious observances. Father Benedict's concern extended beyond the immediate repair needs to questions about preventing future failures. The parish could not afford frequent disruptions to bell service, nor could they easily bear the cost of major repairs or replacement. Edmund would need to not only fix the current problem, but also evaluate the entire mounting system for potential improvements that might prevent similar failures in the future. The technical challenges of bell mounting repairs were complicated by the bell's location high in the church tower. All work had to be done in confined spaces with limited access for tools and materials. The weight of the bronze bell made any movement or repositioning extremely dangerous, requiring careful planning and execution to avoid accidents that could damage the bell, the tower, or the workers involved in the repair. The acoustic properties of the bell were another consideration in the repair planning. Any changes to the mounting system could potentially affect the bell's tone or volume, altering the voice that had become familiar to the entire community. Edmund would need to preserve not just the structural integrity of the mounting system, but also the acoustic characteristics that made the bell's voice distinctive. The religious significance of the work added another dimension to the repair project. The bell was not merely a piece of bronze and iron, but a sacred object that called Christians to worship and marked the sacred moments of community life. Father Benedict would need to perform appropriate blessings and ceremonies as part of the repair process, integrating spiritual and practical considerations in the restoration work. Edmund examined the cracked bracket carefully. The iron had failed at a stress concentration point where the bracket curved sharply around a support beam. This type of failure was common in ironwork that was subjected to repeated loading and unloading, as the bell's weight and swinging motion created alternating stresses that gradually weakened the metal. The repair would require removing the bell from its mounting, a task that would require several strong men and careful planning to avoid damaging either the bell or the church structure. Edmund suggested that the work be done first thing the following morning, when he would have daylight for the careful welding work required to restore the bracket's strength. Father Benedict agreed to arrange for helpers to assist with the bell removal. The repair would need to be completed quickly, as the bell had to be remounted and tested before Sunday services. This type of urgent repair work was part of the blacksmith's responsibility to the community, and Edmund took pride in being able to respond to such emergencies. As the sun began to set, Edmund and William cleaned and organized the smithy for the night. Tools were returned to their proper places, the fire was banked for the night, and the day's completed work was stored safely. The scrollwork panels were nearly finished and would be completed the following day. The chisels were ready for delivery, and William's growing pile of practice nails showed steady improvement in quality and consistency. The evening meal was taken in the small room behind the smithy, where Edmund lived with his wife Margaret and their 2 young children. Margaret had spent the day spinning wool and tending their small garden, work that complemented Edmund's income from the smithy. The children, ages 8 and 10, had attended the village school where they learned reading, writing, and basic arithmetic, along with the religious instruction that formed the foundation of medieval education. After the meal, Edmund often spent time maintaining his tools and equipment. Sharp tools were essential to efficient work, and the daily heating and cooling cycles gradually wore away cutting edges and working surfaces. He used whetstones and files to keep his chisels and punches sharp, and periodically reforged tools that had worn beyond simple sharpening. The anvil face required occasional attention as well. Despite its hardened surface, the constant hammering gradually created small dents and imperfections that could transfer to workpieces. Edmund used careful filing and polishing to maintain the smooth, flat surface that was essential for precise work. This maintenance was usually done in the evening when the smithy was quiet and he could work without interruption. On this particular evening, Edmund also spent time reviewing his supplies and planning the next day's work. The iron stock was adequate for current needs, but coal supplies were running lower than he preferred. A shipment was expected from the mines within the week, but he made a mental note to conserve fuel where possible. The high-carbon steel supply was also becoming depleted, and he would need to contact the traveling merchant about placing another order. The ledger where Edmund recorded his business transactions told the story of a thriving smithy. Regular customers like Thomas the miller, Robert the carpenter, and various local farmers provided steady income through routine repairs and replacement tools. Occasional special projects like Sir Geoffrey's decorative work offered opportunities for higher profits while showcasing his artistic abilities. The church work was often done at reduced rates as part of his Christian duty, but it maintained his reputation as a craftsman who could handle complex and critical repairs. William's apprenticeship was progressing well, and Edmund had begun thinking about the formal requirements for completing the boy's training. In another year or two, William would be ready to attempt his masterpiece, a complex project that would demonstrate his mastery of all the basic blacksmithing skills. If successful, he could then seek recognition as a journeyman and eventually establish his own smithy or find employment with another master smith. The next morning brought cloudy skies and the promise of rain. But Edmund was up before dawn to prepare for the church bell repair. The bracket would need to be removed, repaired, and reinstalled all in one day to ensure the bell was ready for Sunday services. This type of challenging schedule was part of the blacksmith's life, as community needs couldn't always wait for convenient timing. Father Benedict arrived with 4 strong men from the parish just as Edmund finished heating his forge. The bell tower was accessed by a narrow stone stairway that wound around the inside of the church's main structure. Getting the heavy iron bracket down the stairs would be almost as challenging as the repair work itself. The bell, cast from bronze and weighing nearly 300 pounds, had to be carefully lifted from its mounting bracket and temporarily supported while the damaged ironwork was removed. Edmund had brought special slings and ropes for this purpose, along with wooden blocking to distribute the load safely. The work proceeded slowly and carefully, with each movement planned and checked before execution. Once the bracket was removed and brought down to the smithy, Edmund could see the full extent of the damage. The crack extended further than had been visible while the bracket was in position, and additional stress risers suggested that other areas might fail in the near future. A simple weld repair wouldn't be sufficient. The entire bracket would need to be redesigned and strengthened. Working with the focused intensity that emergency repairs demanded, Edmund began the process of cutting away the damaged section of the bracket. The iron was heated to bright orange and cut with a hot chisel, a process that removed the cracked area while leaving clean edges for welding new material. The replacement section would be made from heavier iron bar stock that could better handle the stresses of supporting the swinging bell. The new bracket section was forged with thicker material at the stress concentration points and smoother transitions between different sections. Edmund's experience with similar failures informed his design choices, incorporating lessons learned from previous repairs. The welding work required multiple heat cycles and careful attention to joint quality, as this bracket would need to support the bell's weight for many years to come. William assisted with the repair work, managing the fire and organizing tools while gaining valuable experience with complex welding operations. This type of emergency repair provided learning opportunities that normal production work couldn't match. The pressure of the tight deadline and the critical nature of the repair taught lessons about working efficiently under stress while maintaining quality standards. By mid-afternoon, the new bracket was completed and ready for installation. The welded joints were strong and clean. The mounting holes were properly aligned, and all surfaces were finished to prevent rust formation. Edmund had also applied a coating of linseed oil that would help protect the iron from moisture and extend its service life. The reinstallation process was even more challenging than the removal had been. The heavy bracket had to be positioned precisely to align with mounting holes in the wooden bell frame, while the bell itself waited on temporary supports. Every measurement was checked and rechecked before final assembly, as any misalignment would require disassembly and correction. When the bell was finally remounted and tested, its clear bronze tone rang across the village just as it had before the bracket failure. Father Benedict was relieved and grateful, knowing that Sunday services could proceed as planned. The successful repair added to Edmund's reputation as a smith who could handle difficult and critical work under pressure. The remainder of the week followed a more typical pattern. Edmund completed the scrollwork panels for Sir Geoffrey's gate, spending considerable time on the final details that would distinguish his work from that of less skilled craftsmen. Each leaf was carefully shaped and textured, and the vine stems were given subtle variations that made them appear organic rather than mechanical. William's skills continued to improve, and Edmund began teaching him about different types of iron and steel. Understanding materials was just as important as mastering techniques, as the wrong choice of material could result in tools that failed in service or were unnecessarily expensive to produce. The apprentice learned to identify wrought iron by its fibrous structure when fractured, and to recognize high-carbon steel by its fine grain and response to hardening. The week also brought routine maintenance work that was essential to keeping the village functioning. Plowshares needed sharpening before the autumn planting season. Kitchen knives required reworking to restore their cutting edges. Hinges and latches needed adjustment or replacement as doors and gates wore with constant use. Each type of work required slightly different skills and approaches. Plowshares had to be shaped to cut cleanly through soil without creating excessive drag, while kitchen knives needed to be thin enough to cut food efficiently but strong enough to withstand daily use and cleaning. Hinges required precise fitting to operate smoothly while supporting the weight of heavy wooden doors. The variety of work kept the craft interesting while providing steady income throughout the year. Agricultural implements were most in demand during planting and harvest seasons, while household items needed attention year-round. Construction hardware was busiest during the warmer months when building projects were undertaken. Edmund's reputation for quality work meant that he could charge premium prices for his products, but it also meant that customers expected consistently excellent results. A tool that failed prematurely or a repair that didn't last would quickly damage the trust that had taken years to build. This constant pressure for quality was both challenging and motivating, pushing Edmund to continually refine his techniques and maintain his standards. The business aspects of blacksmithing were just as important as the technical skills. Edmund had to estimate job costs accurately, manage inventory efficiently, and maintain relationships with suppliers and customers. Bad business decisions could ruin a smithy just as quickly as poor craftsmanship could. Saturday mornings were often spent on special projects that required concentrated attention. This particular Saturday, Edmund worked on a commission from a wealthy merchant in the county seat who had ordered a set of decorative fireplace tools. The set included andirons, a poker, tongs, and a shovel, all designed with matching decorative elements that would complement the merchant's elaborate hearth. The andirons were the most complex pieces in the set. These iron supports held burning logs in the fireplace and had to be both functional and beautiful. Edmund forged them from heavy iron bar stock, creating graceful curves that would support substantial weight while adding visual interest to the fireplace setting. The decorative elements included twisted details and hammered textures that caught and reflected the firelight. The poker required a different set of considerations. It had to be long enough to reach into a deep fireplace safely, strong enough to move heavy burning logs, and balanced properly for comfortable use. The working end was forged to a chisel point that could penetrate between logs, while the handle was shaped and textured to provide a secure grip. William was now skilled enough to help with some of the simpler elements of the fireplace toolset. Under Edmund's supervision, he forged the shovel blade from a single piece of sheet iron, gradually hammering it into the curved shape that would scoop ashes efficiently. The process required careful coordination between heating and forming operations, as the thin sheet metal could easily be damaged by overheating or excessive force. The afternoon brought visitors to the smithy. Other craftsmen from the village who often stopped by to discuss techniques and share news from their respective trades. Robert the carpenter talked about a commission he had received for church furniture, work that might require specialized hardware from Edmund. Sarah the weaver mentioned problems with her loom that might need attention from someone skilled in metalwork repair. These informal consultations were an important part of medieval craft culture. Craftsmen often collaborated on complex projects that required multiple skills, and the exchange of technical knowledge benefited everyone involved. Edmund had learned valuable techniques from visiting smiths and was always willing to share his own discoveries with colleagues. The social aspects of the craft were just as important as the technical ones. The smithy often served as an informal gathering place where villagers could discuss current events, share news, and conduct business. Edmund's central role in maintaining the village's tools and infrastructure made him a natural focal point for community activities. Sunday provided a break from the usual work routine. Edmund and his family attended morning mass at the village church, where the recently repaired bell rang clearly to call the faithful to worship. The church service provided spiritual refreshment and community connection that balanced the physical demands of the blacksmith's trade. After church, often spent time with his own tools and equipment. Sunday maintenance was usually limited to cleaning and organizing, but it provided an opportunity to inspect equipment for developing problems that might require attention. A cracked hammer handle could be spotted before it broke completely, preventing potential injury and work delays. The afternoon was typically reserved for family time and personal interests. Edmund enjoyed working wood as a hobby, creating small furniture pieces and toys for his children. This work provided a contrast to his daily metalworking and allowed him to express creativity in a different medium. The precision required for fine woodworking was similar to that needed for decorative ironwork, and skills from one craft often informed the other. As the week began again, Edmund found himself contemplating the broader role of his craft in medieval society. Every tool he made, every repair he completed, contributed to the functioning of the village community. Farmers could plant and harvest crops with properly maintained plows and scythes. Carpenters could build and repair structures with sharp chisels and well-made nails. Cooks could prepare meals with functional knives and sturdy pothooks. The interdependence of medieval crafts meant that problems in one area quickly affected others. A blacksmith who couldn't maintain proper quality would impact every other trade that depended on metal tools. This responsibility was both humbling and motivating, providing a sense of purpose that went beyond simple economic considerations. William's education continued with lessons in the business aspects of smithing. He learned how to estimate material costs, calculate labor time, and price finished work competitively while maintaining profitability. These skills were essential for anyone who hoped to eventually operate their own smithy, and they required just as much attention as the technical aspects of the craft. The apprentice also began learning about the guild system that governed craft trades in larger towns and cities. Although Millbrook was too small to have formal guild organizations, William would likely work in larger communities at some point in his career. Understanding guild rules, quality standards, and business practices would be essential for success in those environments. Advanced techniques formed another important part of William's ongoing education. Edmund demonstrated more complex joining methods, including different types of forge welding and mechanical fastening systems. Each technique had specific applications where it offered advantages over simpler methods, and knowing when to use each approach was a mark of true craftsmanship. The production work continued with steady demand from regular customers. Thomas the miller returned with another repair request, this time for the iron fittings on his grain storage bins. The constant handling of grain had worn the iron hardware, and several pieces needed replacement before the upcoming harvest season. These storage bin fittings were relatively simple pieces, hinges, latches, and reinforcing straps, but they required precise fitting to function properly. Misaligned hinges would bind and wear prematurely, while poorly fitted latches might allow grain to spill or permit rodent access to stored crops. Edmund took careful measurements and made paper templates to ensure accurate reproduction of the worn parts. The work provided good practice opportunities for William, who was now capable of handling routine production pieces with minimal supervision. Edmund would check each piece before final fitting, but William's workmanship had improved to the point where corrections were minor and infrequent. This progress was satisfying for both master and apprentice, representing the successful transfer of knowledge and skills. Autumn was approaching, and with it came the annual cycle of agricultural work that drove much of the smithy's business. Harvest tools needed sharpening and repair before the grain cutting began. Plows required attention before the autumn planting of winter crops. Storage and processing equipment had to be ready for handling the year's grain harvest. The scythe blades that would cut the village's grain required special attention. These long, curved blades had to be razor-sharp to cut through mature wheat and barley stalks cleanly, and they needed to maintain their edge through long days of use. Edmund heated each blade carefully, working at temperatures just hot enough to allow reshaping without damaging the steel structure. The curve of a scythe blade was critical to its function. Too straight, and it wouldn't cut efficiently. Too curved, and it would be difficult to control. The art of scythe making represented one of the most demanding applications of the blacksmith's craft. Each blade was essentially a long, thin knife that had to maintain perfect geometry while withstanding the repeated impacts and bending stresses of agricultural use. The steel used for scythe blades was typically of the highest quality available, often imported from regions known for superior iron and steel production. The forging process for scythe blades began with careful selection of the raw materials. Edmund preferred steel that had been refined through multiple folding and welding operations, creating a homogeneous material with fine-grained structure and consistent carbon content. This preparation work was typically done by specialized steelmakers who sold their products to smiths throughout the region. The initial shaping of the scythe blade involved drawing out a straight bar of steel into the long, thin form that would eventually become the curved cutting edge. This process required perfect temperature control and hammer technique to avoid creating weak spots or irregular grain structure. Edmund worked with smooth, overlapping blows that gradually reduced the steel's thickness while maintaining uniform width across the entire length. The curvature that gave the scythe its distinctive shape was formed through a carefully controlled bending process that had to preserve the steel's internal structure while creating the precise geometry needed for efficient cutting. Edmund used specialized forming tools that supported the blade while allowing controlled deformation. The curve was formed gradually through multiple heating cycles, with frequent checking to ensure proper shape development. The cutting edge of the scythe required particular attention during forging. This area had to be drawn out to optimal thickness for sharpness while maintaining adequate strength to resist chipping and rolling during use. The edge geometry was critical to cutting performance, with subtle variations in angle and thickness affecting how cleanly the blade would cut through different types of grain stalks. The tang area where the blade attached to the wooden handle required different treatment than the cutting portion. This region needed maximum strength to resist the bending and twisting forces transmitted from the handle during use. Edmund typically left this area thicker and used different heat treatment procedures to optimize its mechanical properties for the specific loads it would encounter. The heat treatment process for scythe blades was one of the most critical operations in their manufacture. The cutting edge needed to be hardened to hold a sharp edge, while the back of the blade required toughness to absorb shock loads without breaking. This differential heat treatment required precise temperature control and specialized quenching techniques that Edmund had perfected through years of experience. The testing and finishing operations for completed scythe blades were equally important to their ultimate performance. Edmund would mount each blade in a temporary handle and make trial cuts through bundles of grain stalks to evaluate the cutting action and edge retention.
Any deficiencies in geometry or heat treatment would be revealed by these tests and corrected before the blade was delivered to the customer.
The seasonal nature of scythe use meant that most blade sales and repairs occurred within a relatively short period before and during harvest season. This concentrated demand required Edmund to plan his production carefully, building inventory during slower periods and organizing his workshop to handle the rush of harvest-related work efficiently. The timing was critical because delays in scythe availability could seriously impact farmers' ability to harvest their crops at optimal times. Each scythe blade was hammered on a specialized anvil that Edmund had inherited from his master. This anvil had a curved face that matched the scythe's natural shape, allowing him to maintain the proper geometry while thinning and sharpening the cutting edge. The work required hundreds of light, precise hammer blows, each one moving the metal just slightly toward its final shape. William watched the scythe work with intense interest, knowing that blade sharpening was one of the most demanding skills in the blacksmith's repertoire. The margin for error was minimal. A blade that was too thin would break during use, while one that was too thick wouldn't cut effectively. The heat treatment had to be perfect as well, with the cutting edge hard enough to stay sharp, but the back of the blade tough enough to absorb the shock of cutting through tough stalks. The sickles used for close work and grain gathering required similar attention but different techniques. These smaller, more tightly curved blades were used for cutting grain that grew close to walls or in corners where the long scythe couldn't reach effectively. The smaller size meant they could be heated more quickly. But the tight curves required careful control to prevent the thin metal from buckling or cracking. Edmund's technique for sickle work involved heating small sections of the blade at a time, working gradually around the curve to maintain even temperature distribution. Each section was hammered lightly while hot, then allowed to cool slightly before moving to the next area. This methodical approach prevented the thermal stress that could cause cracking in the thin, curved metal. The local farmers began arriving at the smithy in increasing numbers as harvest time approached. Each brought tools that had seen a full year of use and needed attention before the crucial grain cutting began. Some tools needed simple sharpening, while others required more extensive repairs or complete replacement of worn parts. Old Henrik arrived with a plowshare that had been damaged when it struck a buried stone during spring plowing. The impact had chipped the cutting edge and created a crack that extended back into the main body of the share. This type of damage required careful assessment to determine whether repair was possible or if a complete replacement would be necessary. Edmund examined the damaged plowshare under the bright light of the forge fire. The crack was serious, but hadn't extended into the mounting area where the share attached to the plow frame. A skilled repair could restore the tool to full function, though it would require careful welding and reshaping to match the original profile. The repair began with cutting away the damaged portion of the cutting edge, removing metal until only sound material remained. This was always difficult work because it meant discarding expensive iron, but attempting to repair severely damaged metal often resulted in failure during use. Better to start with good material and ensure a reliable repair. The replacement section was forged from new iron stock, carefully shaped to match the original profile of the plowshare's cutting edge.
The welding process that would join new and old metal required perfect temperature control and precise timing.
Edmund heated both pieces to welding temperature simultaneously, quickly assembled them on the anvil, and hammered the joint closed before either piece could cool below the critical welding heat.
The completed weld was nearly invisible, appearing as just a slight line where the new metal joined the old.
Edmund tested the joint by bending the plowshare slightly and examining the weld area for any signs of weakness or incomplete fusion. Satisfied with the quality of the repair, he began the process of reshaping and sharpening the restored cutting edge.
While Edmund worked on the major repairs, William handled much of the routine sharpening work.
His technique had improved dramatically over the past months, and he could now sharpen most farm tools to Edmund's standards with minimal oversight. The repetitive nature of sharpening work provided excellent practice in heat control and hammer technique, skills that transferred directly to more advanced operations. The afternoon brought Sir Geoffrey to the smithy, come to inspect the completed scrollwork panels for his gate project. The panels were finished and ready for installation, their graceful curves and detailed leafwork representing some of Edmund's finest ornamental craftsmanship. Sir Geoffrey examined each panel carefully, running his fingers over the smooth curves and admiring the subtle textures that brought the iron vines to life. The manor lord was pleased with the work and authorized Edmund to begin the second phase of the project, the gate's functional hardware. This would include heavy hinges capable of supporting the gate's weight, a sophisticated locking mechanism, and various mounting brackets and reinforcements. The functional hardware was less visually dramatic than the decorative panels, but it required equal skill and attention to detail. The gate hinges would be the most challenging part of the hardware commission. Each hinge had to support several hundred pounds while allowing smooth operation through thousands of opening and closing cycles. The pivot pins had to be perfectly straight and smooth, while the hinge leaves needed precise alignment and robust construction. The engineering principles underlying hinge design had been developed through centuries of practical experience by countless blacksmiths working on similar projects. The forces involved in gate operation included not only the static weight of the gate itself, but also the dynamic loads created by wind pressure, thermal expansion and contraction, and the impact forces generated when the gate was opened or closed rapidly. Edmund had to account for all these factors in his design. The materials selected for hinge construction required careful consideration of their intended service environment. The hinges would be exposed to all weather conditions throughout their service life, making corrosion resistance a primary concern. Edmund chose wrought iron for most components because of its superior resistance to rust formation, reserving harder steels only for applications where wear resistance was critical. The manufacturing process for the hinge components required some of Edmund's most precise metalworking techniques. The pivot pins had to be perfectly cylindrical and smooth to minimize wear and ensure smooth operation. This required careful forging, followed by extensive filing and polishing to achieve the necessary surface finish. Even minor irregularities in the pin surface could cause binding or accelerated wear in service. The hinge leaves that attached to the gate and post required precise hole placement and consistent dimensions to ensure proper alignment when installed. Edmund used carefully prepared templates and marking tools to lay out the hole locations, then used specialized punches to create clean, accurate holes. Any errors in hole placement would result in binding or misalignment that could make the gate difficult to operate. The knuckles that housed the pivot pins required the most complex forming operations in the entire hinge manufacturing process. Each knuckle had to be rolled to a precise diameter and carefully aligned with its neighbors to ensure smooth pin insertion and operation. The forming process required specialized tools and techniques that Edmund had developed through years of experience with similar projects. The assembly of the completed hinges required careful fitting and adjustment of all components. The pivot pins had to fit snugly in their bushings without binding, while the hinge leaves needed proper spacing to prevent interference during gate operation. Edmund used shims and spacers to achieve the necessary clearances while maintaining adequate strength and rigidity in the assembled hinges. The testing procedures for completed hinges involved mounting them on a temporary test frame and cycling them through their full range of motion under various load conditions. Edmund checked for smooth operation, proper alignment, and absence of binding or excessive play. Any deficiencies discovered during testing were corrected before the hinges were approved for installation. The surface finishing of the hinges was important both for appearance and corrosion protection. Edmund applied several coats of linseed oil and beeswax that would penetrate the iron surface and provide lasting protection against moisture and oxidation. This finishing process required careful preparation of the metal surfaces and controlled application of the protective coatings. The installation requirements for the gate hinges had to be considered during the design and manufacturing phases. The hinges had to interface properly with both the gate structure and the stone posts that would support them. Edmund worked closely with the stonemasons and carpenters involved in the project to ensure that all components would fit together correctly when final installation took place. Edmund began the hinge work by forging the pivot pins from high-quality wrought iron rod. Each pin had to be perfectly round and uniform along its length, with smooth surfaces that would minimize wear against the hinge bushings. The forming process involved heating the rod to orange heat and rolling it against the anvil while rotating it continuously to maintain roundness. The hinge leaves were cut from flat iron stock using hot chisels and careful layout work. Each leaf had to be identical in size and shape to ensure proper gate alignment when the hinges were installed. The mounting holes were punched while the iron was hot, using specially made punches that created clean, round holes without the rough edges that drilling might leave. Assembly of the hinges required precise fitting of all components. The pivot pins had to fit snugly in their bushings without binding, while the hinge leaves needed proper spacing to prevent interference when the gate swung. Edmund used thin iron washers to adjust clearances and ensure smooth operation under all conditions. Testing the completed hinges involved mounting them temporarily on heavy wooden blocks and cycling them through their full range of motion. Edmund listened carefully to the sounds they made, feeling for any roughness or binding that might indicate problems. Properly made hinges operated almost silently, with just a whisper of metal against metal as they moved. The locking mechanism for the gate was even more complex than the hinges. Sir Geoffrey wanted a system that could be operated from either side of the gate while providing security against unauthorized entry. This required a sophisticated arrangement of levers, springs, and locking bars that had to work reliably in all weather conditions. Edmund sketched several possible designs before settling on a mechanism that used a rotating barrel to control multiple locking points. The barrel would be turned by a key from either side of the gate, with internal cam surfaces moving the locking bars into and out of their securing positions. The design was mechanically elegant, while being robust enough for long-term outdoor use. Manufacturing the lock components required some of Edmund's most precise work. The rotating barrel had to fit its housing with minimal clearance while still operating smoothly. The cam surfaces had to be shaped accurately to ensure proper timing of the locking bar movements. The spring mechanisms had to provide adequate force without being so strong that key operation became difficult. Each component was made individually and carefully fitted to its mating parts. The precision required was similar to that needed for fine jewelry, but the scale and forces involved were much larger. Edmund used his smallest files and most delicate measuring tools to achieve the necessary accuracy. The lock assembly process was methodical and painstaking. Each part had to be positioned exactly right and secured permanently in place. Edmund used a combination of mechanical fasteners and forge welding to create joints that would remain tight under years of use and weather exposure. Testing the completed lock mechanism revealed minor adjustments that were needed for optimal operation. One of the locking bars bound slightly in its guide, requiring careful filing to achieve proper clearance. A spring was slightly too strong, making key operation more difficult than desired. These small issues were typical of complex mechanism work and were quickly corrected. With the gate hardware completed, Edmund turned his attention back to the seasonal agricultural work that formed the backbone of his business. The harvest season was beginning in earnest, and farmers throughout the area were bringing tools for last-minute sharpening and repairs. The grain scythes that had been sharpened earlier in the week were already returning for touch-up work. The demanding nature of grain cutting meant that even the best-maintained blades needed frequent attention during the harvest season. Edmund had established a priority system that ensured critical tools received immediate attention, while less urgent work waited for slack periods. The touch-up work on scythe blades was quick but critical. Each blade was examined for nicks and dull spots, then heated just enough to allow light hammering that restored the sharp edge. The work had to be done carefully to avoid overheating the thin metal, which could destroy the blade's temper and ruin its cutting ability. William had become proficient at this type of maintenance, sharpening and could handle most of the routine work without supervision. His understanding of proper heat colors and hammer technique had advanced to the point where Edmund trusted him with valuable customer tools. This progress represented a significant milestone in William's apprenticeship and freed Edmund to focus on more complex work. The busiest part of harvest season brought a steady stream of customers to the smithy from dawn until well after sunset. Farmers would arrive with tools that had broken during the day's work, needing immediate repairs to avoid delays in their grain cutting. Edmund often worked by lantern light to complete emergency repairs that couldn't wait until morning. One evening brought a particularly challenging emergency repair. A large scythe blade had snapped near the mounting tang, leaving the farmer with no way to continue cutting his grain crop. The break was clean, but occurred in a location that made simple welding difficult. Edmund would need to forge a new tang section and attach it to the existing blade. The repair work began with careful examination of the broken blade to understand why the failure had occurred. The metal showed signs of fatigue cracking that had developed gradually over multiple seasons of use. The crack had finally propagated completely across the blade when it encountered a particularly tough stock during cutting. Creating a new tang section required selecting iron that matched the characteristics of the original blade material. Edmund chose a piece of wrought iron with similar carbon content and grain structure, then began the careful process of shaping it to match the original tang dimensions. The new section had to fit precisely into the scythe handle and provide secure attachment for the repaired blade. The welding process that would join the new tang to the existing blade was critical to the repair's success. Both pieces were heated to welding temperature and joined with careful hammerwork that ensured complete fusion between old and new metal. The weld area was then shaped and finished to match the original blade profile. Testing the repaired scythe involved mounting it in a handle and making trial cuts through bundles of grain stalks. The blade cut cleanly and showed no signs of weakness at the weld joint. The farmer was able to resume his harvest work the following morning with full confidence in the repaired tool. The successful emergency repair added to Edmund's reputation as a smith who could solve difficult problems under pressure. Word of such successes traveled quickly through the farming community, bringing additional customers who valued the reliability and quality of his work. As autumn progressed, the nature of the smithy's work began to shift from harvest tools to equipment needed for grain processing and storage. Flail handles needed iron reinforcement bands to withstand the repeated impact of grain threshing. Storage bins required new latches and hinges to secure the year's grain harvest against rodents and theft. The grain processing equipment used by the village miller required extensive maintenance before the busy threshing season began. Millstones needed new iron banding to prevent cracking under the tremendous forces of grain grinding. Drive shafts required bearing surfaces to be renewed where wear had created excessive clearances. Edmund's work on the mill equipment required understanding of the mechanical principles involved in grain processing. The millstones had to be perfectly balanced and aligned to grind grain evenly without generating excessive heat that could damage the flour. The iron banding that held the stones provided both structural support and a means of adjusting their spacing for different types of grain. The drive mechanisms that connected the mill's water wheel to the grinding stones required precise maintenance of all bearing surfaces and mechanical connections. Any looseness or misalignment in these systems would result in uneven grinding and potential damage to expensive mill components. Working on mill equipment also provided valuable learning opportunities for William. The large scale and heavy forces involved required techniques that weren't needed for typical blacksmith work. Special lifting equipment was needed to handle the massive stone wheels, and heating such large iron components required careful fire management to ensure even temperature distribution. The miller's work was critical to the entire village's food supply, making his equipment maintenance a high priority for Edmund's smithy. Problems with the mill could affect everyone's ability to process grain into flour, potentially creating serious food shortages if not resolved quickly. November brought the first frost of the season, and a corresponding shift in the types of work arriving at the smithy. Agricultural tools were stored away until spring, replaced by equipment needed for winter activities. Wood-cutting tools needed attention before the serious business of cutting and splitting firewood began. Hunting equipment required sharpening and repair before the winter hunting season. The axes and splitting mauls used for firewood preparation had to withstand tremendous forces while maintaining sharp cutting edges. The heads were forged from high-carbon steel that could be hardened to hold a keen edge, while the eye that fitted over the wooden handle was made from tougher wrought iron that could absorb impact shock without cracking. The design principles underlying axe construction had been refined over generations of use, with each element of the tool optimized for specific aspects of woodcutting performance. The weight distribution between the cutting edge and the back of the head affected how the axe would behave during the swing, with different balances preferred for different types of cutting tasks. A splitting axe required different geometry than a felling axe, and both differed from the smaller hatchets used for kindling preparation. The metallurgy involved in axe making represented some of the most sophisticated techniques in the medieval blacksmith's repertoire. The cutting edge required very hard steel that could take and hold an extremely sharp edge, while the body of the axe head needed toughness to absorb the shock of impact without cracking or deforming. Achieving these different properties in a single piece required careful control of composition, forging techniques, and heat treatment procedures. The eye of the axe, which fitted over the wooden handle, required special attention during forging. This oval-shaped opening had to be precisely sized and shaped to mate properly with the wooden handle while providing maximum strength in the most highly stressed area of the tool. Edmund used specialized tools called drift pins to gradually expand and shape the eye, working carefully to maintain proper wall thickness and avoid creating stress concentration points. The handle attachment system for axes was critical to both performance and safety. A loose or improperly fitted handle could result in the head flying off during use, creating serious danger to the user and bystanders. Edmund worked closely with the village's woodcrafters to ensure that handle and head dimensions matched perfectly, and he often performed the final fitting and securing operations himself to guarantee proper assembly. The grinding and sharpening of axe blades required different techniques than those used for other cutting tools. The large size and curved geometry of axe blades made them difficult to handle on conventional grinding stones, requiring specialized techniques and fixtures to maintain proper edge angles and avoid overheating the steel. Edmund had developed methods for sharpening axes that preserved their temper while achieving optimal cutting performance. The seasonal demand for axe work created planning challenges for Edmund's workshop schedule. The brief period between the first frosts and the onset of serious cold weather created a concentrated demand for axe sharpening and repair that had to be accommodated alongside other winter preparation work. This timing pressure required careful organization and sometimes extended working hours to meet customer needs. Different types of wood required different axe characteristics for optimal cutting performance. The hardwoods, like oak and ash, that provided the best fuel for winter heating required axes with different edge angles and weights than those used for softwood cutting. Edmund's customers often owned multiple axes optimized for different tasks, and he maintained detailed knowledge of each tool's intended use and optimal configuration. The splitting wedges used in conjunction with axes for processing large logs represented another category of winter tools that required Edmund's attention. These wedges had to be extremely durable to withstand repeated heavy blows from sledgehammers while maintaining their ability to split wood effectively. The geometry of splitting wedges was critical to their performance, with different angles and proportions suited to different wood types and splitting techniques. The maintenance and repair of existing axes often required more skill than manufacturing new ones. Worn or damaged axe heads had to be evaluated to determine whether repair was economically justified compared to replacement. Successful repairs required understanding of the original manufacturing techniques and the ability to match new work to existing materials and heat treatment. Edmund took pride in his ability to restore even severely damaged axes to full functionality. The cultural significance of axes in medieval society extended beyond their practical utility as tools. Quality axes were often passed down through generations as valuable family possessions, accumulating both monetary and sentimental value over decades of use. The restoration of heirloom axes required sensitivity to their historical significance, as well as technical expertise in metalworking. The forge welding techniques used in axe construction and repair represented some of the most demanding applications of this fundamental blacksmithing skill. Joining different types of steel and iron in a single tool required perfect execution of welding procedures, as any flaws in the joints could result in catastrophic tool failure during use. Edmund's reputation for reliable axe work was built on his mastery of these critical welding operations. The testing and quality control procedures for completed axes were necessarily destructive, requiring actual cutting tests to verify performance characteristics. Edmund would test each finished axe by making cuts through various types of wood, checking for proper cutting action, edge retention, and handle security. This testing process occasionally revealed problems that required additional work or complete remanning of the tool. The economics of axe work required careful balancing of material costs, labor time, and pricing to maintain profitability while providing value to customers. High-quality steel was expensive, and the time required for proper heat treatment and finishing added substantially to production costs. Edmund had to price his work to reflect these costs while remaining competitive with other smiths in the region. The winter woodcutting season brought its own hazards and challenges that affected the design and maintenance of cutting tools. Cold weather made steel more brittle and prone to sudden failure, requiring adjustments to heat treatment procedures and more frequent inspection of tools in use. Edmund worked with his customers to develop maintenance schedules that would minimize the risk of tool failure during critical woodcutting operations. Edmund's technique for axe making involved forge welding different types of steel and iron together to create a composite head with optimal properties in each area. The cutting edge was formed from hard, high-carbon steel that would take and hold a razor-sharp edge. The sides of the head used medium-carbon steel that provided good toughness while still allowing some hardening. The eye was made from soft wrought iron that could deform slightly under impact without cracking. The welding process that joined these different materials was one of the most demanding operations in the blacksmith's repertoire. Each material had slightly different welding characteristics, and the joints had to be perfect to prevent failure during use. Edmund used carefully controlled temperatures and specially prepared flux materials to ensure clean, strong welds between the different steel types. Heat treatment of the completed axe head required understanding of how the different materials would respond to heating and cooling. The high-carbon cutting edge needed full hardening and careful tempering, while the softer areas had to be protected from excessive hardening that might make them brittle. Testing a completed axe involved making cuts through various types of wood to evaluate the edge retention and impact resistance. A properly made axe would cut cleanly through hardwood without chipping or dulling, while the head would remain firmly attached to the handle despite repeated heavy impacts. Winter preparation work also included maintenance of heating and cooking equipment. Fireplace tools needed repair and replacement after a year of use. Cooking pots and pans required new handles or patches to extend their service life. Stoves and heating systems needed attention to ensure safe and efficient operation through the cold months ahead. The fireplace tools that Edmund had created earlier for the wealthy merchant served as examples of the type of quality work that distinguished his smithy from less skilled competitors. Each tool was both functional and beautiful, designed to provide years of reliable service while enhancing the appearance of the fireplace setting. December brought the shortest days of the year and the challenges of working with limited daylight. The smithy's small windows provided minimal illumination during the brief winter days, making Edmund increasingly dependent on the forge fire's glow for working light. Oil lamps and candles supplemented the natural light, but were expensive and provided limited illumination for detailed work. The reduced daylight hours concentrated the day's work into a shorter period, requiring careful planning to ensure that critical tasks received adequate attention. Complex work that required good visibility was scheduled for midday when natural light was best, while routine tasks that could be done by feel were reserved for early morning and late afternoon. Winter also brought different types of customer requests. Ice cutting tools needed sharpening for the annual harvest of pond ice that would be stored for summer cooling. Sleigh hardware required maintenance and repair before the snow made wheeled transportation impractical.
Indoor crafts and cottage industries increased their demand for specialized tools during the months when outdoor work was limited. The ice cutting equipment used by the village's ice harvesters required specialized knowledge and techniques. Ice saws had to cut cleanly through thick pond ice without binding or wandering off course. The teeth were shaped differently from wood saws to handle the unique characteristics of ice cutting. Tongs for lifting and moving ice blocks needed precise jaw alignment and strong, smooth operation despite exposure to freezing temperatures. Edmund's work on ice harvesting tools connected him to the broader regional economy that extended beyond the immediate village. The harvested ice would be sold to cities and towns throughout the region, providing income for local workers while supplying a valuable commodity for food preservation and summer comfort. The complexity of the regional economy meant that Edmund's work had impacts far beyond the immediate community. Tools he made might be used to harvest crops that fed distant cities, or to craft goods that were traded across multiple counties. This broader perspective added meaning to even the most routine work, knowing that each well-made tool contributed to the functioning of medieval society. Winter evenings provided opportunities for Edmund to work on special projects that required concentrated attention. With fewer daylight interruptions and reduced customer traffic, he could focus on complex commissions that demanded his highest skill levels. This winter, he was working on a commission from the regional cathedral that had requested a set of ornamental ironwork for a new chapel. The Cathedral of St. Dunstan, located in the county seat some 30 miles from Millbrook, was one of the most magnificent religious structures in the region. Built over several centuries with contributions from kings, nobles, and common folk alike, it represented the pinnacle of medieval architectural achievement and spiritual devotion. The new chapel being added to the cathedral complex was dedicated to Saint Kester. Eligius, the patron saint of metalworkers, making Edmund's commission particularly meaningful to him as a craftsman. The significance of working for such a prestigious institution extended far beyond the immediate project. Cathedral commissions were typically awarded only to craftsmen of proven exceptional ability, and successful completion of such work could establish a smith's reputation throughout the entire region. The artistic and technical standards demanded for cathedral work were the highest in medieval society, requiring absolute perfection in every aspect of design, execution, and finishing. The design process for cathedral ironwork involved collaboration with church architects, theologians, and artistic advisors who ensured that every element would contribute appropriately to the sacred space. Edmund had traveled to the cathedral on several occasions to study the existing ironwork and meet with church officials to discuss their requirements. These consultations had provided invaluable insights into the symbolic meanings and functional requirements that would guide his work. The materials specified for cathedral work were of the finest quality available, regardless of cost. The church authorities had authorized the use of imported steel from the renowned forges of Toledo, where Moorish and Christian metalworking traditions had created some of the world's finest steel alloys. This material was incredibly expensive, but essential for work that was expected to endure for centuries while maintaining its appearance and functionality.
The artistic elements of the commission incorporated complex theological symbolism that required Edmund to understand not only metalworking techniques, but also the religious meanings embedded in every decorative detail. Vine motifs represented Christ's teaching about being the true vine, while wheat and grape patterns symbolized the Eucharistic bread and wine. Angels and saints had to be depicted with attributes that would be recognizable to the faithful while conforming to established iconographic traditions. The technical challenges of cathedral ironwork were equally demanding. The pieces had to integrate seamlessly with stone architecture that was itself a masterpiece of engineering and artistry. Load-bearing elements had to be calculated precisely to ensure structural integrity, while decorative elements had to be proportioned and positioned to enhance rather than compete with the architectural setting. The scale of cathedral work required techniques and tools that differed significantly from those used for ordinary commissions. Some pieces were large enough to require special handling equipment and modified forging procedures. The workshop had to be reorganized to accommodate workpieces that were too large for normal anvil work, requiring the construction of temporary supports and work surfaces. The finishing requirements for cathedral ironwork demanded perfection in every detail. Surface textures had to be uniform and precisely controlled to achieve the desired visual effects. Any tool marks, scratches, or irregularities that might be acceptable in utilitarian work were completely unacceptable for pieces that would be scrutinized by thousands of worshippers over the centuries of their service life. The installation of cathedral ironwork required coordination with multiple other craftsmen working on the chapel project. Stonemasons, carpenters, glaziers, and painters all had to coordinate their efforts to ensure that Edmund's metalwork would integrate properly with their contributions. This collaboration required diplomatic skills and flexible scheduling that complemented his technical abilities. The spiritual significance of the work added another dimension to Edmund's approach to the project. He began each day's work on the cathedral commission with prayer, asking for divine guidance in his efforts to create beauty worthy of God's house. The knowledge that his work would serve as a focus for worship and devotion for generations provided inspiration that transcended mere commercial considerations. The preservation of cathedral ironwork for future generations required Edmund to consider not only current performance requirements, but also long-term durability under conditions that were difficult to predict. Changes in climate, structural settling, and evolving maintenance practices all had to be anticipated in the design and execution of work that was expected to last for centuries. The documentation requirements for cathedral work were more extensive than those for ordinary commissions. Detailed drawings, material specifications, and installation instructions had to be prepared and preserved for future craftsmen who might need to perform maintenance or repairs. This documentation process required skills in draftsmanship and technical writing that complemented Edmund's metalworking abilities. The economic impact of cathedral work on Edmund's business was substantial but complex. While the project provided significant income and prestige, it also required extensive time and material investments that tied up capital and workshop capacity for extended periods. The irregular payment schedules, typical of large institutional projects, required careful financial planning to maintain cash flow during the extended production period. The educational value of cathedral work for William's apprenticeship was immeasurable. Exposure to the highest levels of craftsmanship and artistic achievement provided learning opportunities that could not be obtained through ordinary commercial work. The techniques and standards established through cathedral work would influence William's approach to all future projects, raising his capabilities far above those of smiths who had never been challenged by such demanding work. The regional reputation that Edmund gained through cathedral work opened doors to additional prestigious commissions from noble families and religious institutions throughout the area. The network of relationships established through cathedral projects often led to referrals and recommendations that sustained high-level work for years after the original project's completion. The artistic legacy of cathedral ironwork provided Edmund with a form of immortality that transcended the normal limits of craftsmen's careers. Long after he had retired or died, his work would continue to inspire worshippers and demonstrate the heights of achievement possible through dedicated craftsmanship. This knowledge provided profound satisfaction that went far beyond financial rewards or professional recognition. The cathedral work represented the pinnacle of medieval blacksmithing, requiring artistic vision combined with supreme technical skill. The pieces would be seen by hundreds of worshippers and had to reflect the glory and majesty of the church. Every detail had to be perfect, from the overall proportions to the smallest decorative elements. The design incorporated religious symbols and motifs that required careful research and planning. Edmund consulted with church scholars to ensure that his interpretation of biblical scenes and symbolic elements was theologically appropriate. The artistic challenge was to create pieces that were both beautiful and meaningful, conveying spiritual messages through the medium of shaped iron. Working on cathedral commissions also required understanding of architectural principles and structural requirements. The ironwork had to integrate seamlessly with the stone and wood construction while providing necessary structural support. Load calculations and stress analysis were just as important as artistic considerations. The prestige associated with cathedral work brought benefits beyond immediate compensation. Successfully completing such a commission enhanced Edmund's reputation throughout the region and often led to additional high-profile projects. The skills developed in creating ecclesiastical ironwork also had applications in secular decorative projects. As winter deepened, Edmund reflected on the year's accomplishments and began planning for the coming season. William's apprenticeship had progressed remarkably well, and the young man was now capable of handling most routine smithy work independently. The business had grown steadily, with new customers added while maintaining relationships with established ones. The review of the year's work revealed the breadth and complexity of the blacksmith's role in medieval society. Edmund's ledgers showed entries for hundreds of individual projects, ranging from simple nail repairs to complex architectural commissions. Each entry represented not just a business transaction, but a contribution to the community's ability to function and prosper. The tools he had made and repaired had enabled farming, construction, food preparation, transportation, and countless other activities essential to medieval life. The customer relationships that Edmund had built over the years represented one of his most valuable business assets. Trust, developed through consistent quality and reliable service, created loyalty that transcended simple price competition. Customers who knew they could depend on Edmund's work were willing to pay premium prices and wait for his schedule rather than risk inferior service from less established competitors. The seasonal patterns that governed the smithy's work had become deeply ingrained in Edmund's planning and operations. Each season brought predictable demands that could be anticipated and prepared for, along with unexpected emergencies that required flexibility and quick response. The ability to balance routine production with emergency repairs while maintaining quality standards was one of the marks of a successful smith. The apprenticeship system that had trained Edmund and was now training William represented a continuous chain of knowledge transfer that stretched back to the earliest days of ironworking. Each generation of smiths added their own innovations and improvements while preserving the fundamental techniques that made the craft possible. William's progress represented not just individual achievement, but the continuation of this ancient tradition. The tools and equipment that filled Edmund's workshop told the story of decades of investment in capability and capacity. Each anvil, hammer, and specialized tool represented a decision to commit resources to improving the workshop's abilities. The gradual accumulation of better tools and more efficient equipment was both a result of success and a foundation for future growth. The technical knowledge that Edmund had accumulated through years of experience encompassed not only practical skills, but also theoretical understanding of metallurgy, mechanics, and material science that would not be formally codified for centuries. This empirical knowledge, gained through trial and error and passed down through apprenticeship, was as sophisticated as any formal engineering education. The economic role that the smithy played in the local community extended far beyond the direct value of services provided. By enabling other trades and activities to function effectively, Edmund's work multiplied its impact throughout the regional economy. A well-maintained plow could increase agricultural productivity. A sharp saw could improve construction efficiency. And reliable tools of all types enhanced the effectiveness of every other craft and occupation. The social position that Edmund occupied as a master craftsman brought both privileges and responsibilities. His expertise was valued and respected, giving him influence in community decisions and access to information that might not be available to others. In return, he was expected to use his skills for community benefit, providing emergency repairs and maintaining critical infrastructure regardless of personal convenience or profit considerations. The geographic reach of Edmund's reputation extended well beyond the immediate village boundaries. Customers traveled from neighboring communities to seek his services, and other smiths consulted with him on technical problems and techniques. This regional recognition was both personally satisfying and professionally valuable, opening opportunities for high-value work and collaborative projects. The competitive environment in which Edmund operated required constant attention to quality, efficiency, and innovation. Other smiths in the region were equally skilled and ambitious, making complacency dangerous to long-term success. The pressure of competition drove continuous improvement in techniques, equipment, and business practices that benefited both Edmund and his customers. The regulatory environment of medieval craftsmanship was enforced more through custom and reputation than through formal legal structures. Guild systems in larger towns provided formal standards and dispute resolution mechanisms. But in smaller communities like Millbrook, quality control depended largely on market forces and community expectations. Reputation was the ultimate regulatory mechanism, making consistent quality essential to long-term success. The training responsibilities that came with taking apprentices required Edmund to balance production demands with educational objectives. Teaching effective techniques while maintaining productivity was a constant challenge, requiring patience and skill that complemented technical expertise. The success of former apprentices reflected on their master's abilities, making training quality important to long-term reputation. The financial management of the smithy required skills that went far beyond metalworking expertise. Material procurement, inventory management, pricing strategies, and cash flow planning all demanded attention and competence. The seasonal nature of much smithy work created particular challenges in maintaining adequate working capital through slow periods while building reserves for busy seasons. The family relationships that were intertwined with business operations added another layer of complexity to Edmund's responsibilities. Margaret's contributions to household management and child-rearing freed him to focus on smithy work, while the children's education and future prospects were directly affected by the business's success. The balance between family and business demands required careful attention and occasional difficult choices. The physical demands of blacksmithing were cumulative, with years of heavy hammer work and heat exposure gradually taking their toll on Edmund's body. Planning for the eventual transition to lighter work or retirement required consideration of how to maintain income while reducing physical stress. William's development as a capable smith was essential to this transition, making apprentice training as much a personal necessity as a community service. The technological evolution of blacksmithing techniques was gradual but continuous, with small improvements and innovations accumulating over time to enhance productivity and quality. Edmund's contributions to this evolution, though individually modest, were part of the collective advancement that characterized all medieval crafts. Each successful technique or tool improvement was shared with colleagues and passed on to apprentices, contributing to the craft's overall development. The cultural significance of the blacksmith's role in medieval society reflected the fundamental importance of iron tools and implements to civilization itself. From the earliest agricultural implements to the most sophisticated architectural hardware, iron products created and maintained by smiths like Edmund were essential to human progress and prosperity. This cultural importance provided meaning and dignity to work that might otherwise have been viewed as merely physical labor. The successful completion of challenging projects like Sir Geoffrey's gate hardware and the Cathedral Commission had demonstrated Edmund's capabilities at the highest levels of the craft. These prestigious projects provided both financial rewards and professional satisfaction that made the long hours and physical demands worthwhile. Planning for the coming year involved assessing equipment needs and scheduling major maintenance projects. The forge would need reconstruction before the busy spring season began, as constant heating and cooling cycles gradually wore away the fire brick lining. The bellows leather would need replacement after 2 years of steady use. Several tools required major repairs or replacement after showing signs of wear. The approach of spring also meant preparing for the annual cycle of agricultural work that would soon begin again. Plowshares would need sharpening and repair before the spring planting season. Harness hardware would require attention after storage through the winter months. Garden tools would need reconditioning for another growing season. The transition from winter to spring work represented one of the most demanding periods in the smithy's annual cycle. The concentrated demand for agricultural tool preparation coincided with continuing needs for winter equipment repairs and the urgent requirements of spring construction projects. This convergence of demands required careful planning and efficient workflow management to serve all customers adequately while maintaining quality standards. The plow maintenance that dominated early spring work was critical to the year's agricultural success. Worn or damaged plowshares could result in poor furrows that would reduce crop yields and increase planting difficulties. The investment of time and materials in proper plow preparation was repaid many times over through improved agricultural productivity and reduced fieldwork requirements. The variety of plow designs used throughout the region required Edmund to maintain expertise with different systems and components. Heavy moldboard plows used for breaking new ground had different requirements than the lighter plows used for cultivating established fields. Each design required specific techniques for maintenance and repair, making plow work one of the more technically demanding aspects of agricultural tool service. The scheduling challenges created by concentrated spring demand required diplomatic skills as well as technical competence. Customers who had delayed winter maintenance work until spring created urgent demands that had to be balanced against the needs of more foresighted farmers who had planned ahead. Edmund's reputation for fairness in handling such conflicts was important to maintaining good customer relationships. The harness hardware used to connect draft animals to plows and other implements was subject to tremendous stresses that gradually weakened metal components over time. The replacement of worn buckles, rings, and connecting hardware was essential to preventing equipment failures that could injure valuable draft animals or damage expensive implements. This work required understanding of both metallurgy and animal husbandry to create hardware that would perform reliably under actual field conditions. The garden tools used for vegetable cultivation required different characteristics than field implements designed for grain production. Hoes, spades, and cultivators used in gardens had to be lighter and more maneuverable than their field counterparts, while still being durable enough for intensive use. The smaller scale of garden work allowed for more precise tool design and higher quality materials that would be economically impractical for large field implements. The seasonal rhythm of tool demand created opportunities for Edmund to develop specialized expertise in particular areas, while maintaining competence across the full range of smithy work. Spring agricultural tool preparation allowed him to refine techniques and develop innovations that improved tool performance and durability.
These improvements often became standard practices that enhanced his reputation and attracted customers from greater distances.
The weather dependency of spring agricultural work created unpredictable demands that required flexibility in workshop scheduling. Late spring storms or early warm spells could suddenly change farmers' priorities, creating urgent demands for different types of tools and equipment. Edmund's ability to respond quickly to these changing demands was important to maintaining customer satisfaction and business success. The collaborative relationships that developed between Edmund and other craftsmen during spring preparation work were essential to serving customer needs effectively. Wooden handles, leather components, and other non-metal parts of tools often required attention simultaneously with ironwork repairs. Coordination with carpenters, leatherworkers, and other specialists ensured that customers received completely functional tools rather than just repaired metal components. The inventory management challenges created by spring demand required Edmund to balance the costs of carrying adequate supplies against the risks of shortages during peak periods. Commonly needed items like plowshare steel and standard fasteners had to be stocked in advance, while specialty items were obtained as needed for specific projects. This balance required both business acumen and technical knowledge to predict demand patterns accurately. The quality control requirements for agricultural tools were particularly stringent because of the critical timing of spring fieldwork. A tool failure during planting season could result in delayed seeding that would reduce the entire year's harvest. Edmund's reputation depended on his ability to deliver repairs and new tools that would perform reliably throughout the demanding agricultural season. The training opportunities that spring work provided for William were invaluable for developing his skills across the full range of smithy operations. The variety of agricultural tools and the concentrated work schedule exposed him to techniques and challenges that were not encountered during other seasons. This intensive experience was essential to developing the competence and confidence needed for independent practice. The economic impact of spring work on the smithy's annual income was substantial, often accounting for a significant portion of total yearly revenue. The pricing strategies used during this period had to balance the premium value of timely service against the need to maintain long-term customer relationships. Edmund's approach to pricing reflected both immediate business needs and long-term strategic considerations. The physical demands of spring work required Edmund to manage his energy and capabilities carefully to avoid exhaustion or injury during the critical preparation period. The long hours and intensive labor required during spring preparation had to be balanced against the need to maintain productivity throughout the rest of the year. This required both physical conditioning and strategic planning to sustain optimal performance. The community relationships that were reinforced through spring work were important to Edmund's integration into village social structures. Successful preparation of agricultural tools contributed directly to community prosperity, making the smith's work visible and appreciated by all residents. This community standing provided both personal satisfaction and business advantages that extended throughout the year. The technological innovations that emerged from spring work often had applications throughout the year and across different types of tools and equipment. Improvements in timbering techniques, joint designs, or material selection that were developed for agricultural tools could be adapted to other applications, creating ongoing benefits that extended far beyond the immediate spring projects. Edmund's role in this annual cycle connected him intimately to the rhythms of agricultural life that governed medieval society. His work enabled the farming that fed the community, supported the crafts that served daily needs, and maintained the infrastructure that made village life possible. The apprenticeship system that had trained Edmund and was now training William ensured the continuation of essential skills from generation to generation. Each master smith passed on not just technical knowledge, but also the ethical standards and community responsibilities that made the craft a cornerstone of medieval society. As February arrived and the days slowly began to lengthen, Edmund started the preparations that would ready his smithy for another year of service to the community. The cycle was beginning again, with familiar challenges and new opportunities awaiting in the months ahead. The enduring nature of the blacksmith's craft provided stability in a world where change was often threatening rather than welcome. The techniques Edmund used had been refined over generations of smiths, each adding their own improvements while preserving the fundamental knowledge that made the craft possible. The tools Edmund made would outlast their makers, serving the community for decades while enabling countless other activities and crafts. This permanence gave meaning to the daily work, knowing that each carefully forged piece contributed to something larger and more enduring than individual efforts. The relationships Edmund had built with customers, suppliers, and fellow craftsmen created a network of mutual support that strengthened the entire community. The trust placed in his skills and integrity was both humbling and motivating, providing constant incentive for excellence in every aspect of his work. William's emerging skills represented hope for the future continuation of the craft. The knowledge and techniques passed from master to apprentice ensured that the village would continue to have access to the metalworking skills essential to medieval life. The seasonal rhythms that governed the smithy's work connected it to the larger patterns of medieval existence. Like the farmers whose tools he made and the craftsmen whose equipment he maintained, Edmund's work followed ancient patterns that had proven their worth through generations of use. The smithy itself, with its massive stone walls and well-worn tools, represented continuity with the past while serving present needs. The building would shelter future smiths just as it had protected Edmund's work, providing the stable environment necessary for the craft's continuation. As winter gradually gave way to spring, Edmund looked forward to another season of meaningful work in service to his community. The forge fire that would soon burn brighter represented not just the heat needed for metalworking, but the continuing flame of a craft that had shaped human civilization for millennia. The story of Edmund's smithy was repeated in thousands of villages across medieval Europe, each contributing to the vast network of craftsmen whose skills made medieval society possible. The hammers ringing on anvils in countless workshops created the symphony of human industry that built and maintained the medieval world. The simple act of heating iron and shaping it with hammer blows connected Edmund to smiths throughout history, from ancient times to his own medieval present. The fire that heated his iron was the same fire that had served smiths since the discovery of ironworking, passed down through generations of craftsmen who had refined and perfected the techniques of their trade. The night settled peacefully over Millbrook as Edmund banked his forge fire for the last time, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to serve his community through the ancient and honorable craft of blacksmithing. The glowing coals that would preserve the fire through the night represented the continuity of tradition, the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next, and the enduring human desire to create beauty and utility from the raw materials of the earth. Good night.